The blood on Ethan Prescott's knuckles had barely dried from helping his bride secure her travel pack when he heard the screams from downstream. And in that single breath, every careful plan for their wedding journey shattered like creek ice in spring thaw. He had been checking the horses at the crossing while Priya Clearwater waded into the shallows to refill their water skins, her green skin bright against the gray river stones, her small tusks visible in the smile she had given him over her shoulder. They had traveled this route 3 times during their courtship, visiting her clan and his homestead in turn, building the trust that had led to her accepting his proposal 2 months past. The river ran shallow here in late summer, barely to her knees, and they had both let their guard down in the familiar territory. The raiders came from the willow thicket on the far bank, where the trail bent east toward the hill country. 4 of them, human, mounted and armed with the casual cruelty of men who had done this work before. Ethan saw Priya turn at the first splash, saw her drop the water skins and reach for the knife at her belt, but they were on her before she could clear leather. One rider swept down and caught her around the waist, yanking her up and across his saddle, while another knocked the blade from her hand with a length of wood. She fought, elbows and fists and the strength that came from working her family's forge since childhood. But the third rider caught her legs and together they bound her wrists with practiced speed. Ethan was running before his mind caught up with his body, splashing into the river with his own knife drawn, but the 4th raider wheeled to face him with a crossbow already leveled at his chest. The man was perhaps 40, gray in his beard, with the kind of patient eyes that said he would absolutely pull the trigger if pressed. "Stay there, friend," the raider said, not unkindly. "We just want the green girl. No need for you to die over it." Priya was shouting now, wordless rage that carried across the water. The raider holding her backhanded her across the mouth hard enough that her head snapped to the side, and Ethan felt something cold settle in his chest. He took another step forward, knee-deep in the current. The crossbow came up another inch. "I said stay." "She is my betrothed," Ethan said, and his voice came out flat and hard in a way it rarely did. He had been a farmer most of his life, quiet and careful with his words, but there were depths in him that even Priya had only begun to see. "Let her go and ride away, last chance." The gray-bearded man actually laughed at that, a short bark that held no humor. "Your betrothed, is she? Well, someone will pay handsomely to get her back then, won't they?" He jerked his head at the others. "Move out." They wheeled their horses and plunged back into the willows, Priya still struggling across the saddle of the lead rider. Ethan watched her green skin disappear into the shadows, watched the leaves swallow the sound of hoofbeats heading north into the broken country, where the maps grew vague and the law thinner still. The crossbowman backed his horse carefully, keeping Ethan in his sights until he reached the tree line. Then he too vanished. The river ran on, indifferent. Ethan stood in the water for perhaps 10 seconds more, his heart hammering against his ribs, his knife still in his hand. Then he turned and ran for the horses. His father had been a scout in the border wars before settling down to farm, and he had taught Ethan to read ground the way other men read books. The tracking gear was still packed in the saddlebags, because Ethan had never quite shaken the habit of carrying it. A leather roll of tools his father had pressed into his hands on his deathbed 3 years past. He slung it across his shoulder now along with his bow and quiver, his bedroll, and a bag of dried meat and journey bread. The rest he left, including Priya's carefully packed belongings that she had been so excited to show him just this morning. He did not ride for help. The nearest settlement was half a day south, and by the time he returned with whoever he could rouse, the trail would be cold and Priya would be miles deeper into country where even trackers lost the thread. He had seen what happened to captives who waited on rescue. Some came back. Many did not. He would not gamble Priya's life on the goodwill of strangers or the speed of justice that moved at the pace of committees and councils. He would go now, alone, and he would bring her home. The trail was easy at first. 4 horses moving fast through the willows left bent stems and torn leaves, hoofprints in the soft earth where the trees opened into scrub grass. Ethan followed at a steady pace, not pushing his horse but not resting either, his eyes on the ground and the horizon in turns. The raiders were heading northeast, away from the main roads and toward the limestone hills where water ran scarce and settlements were few. Bad country for a chase, but it meant they would need to stop for water and rest eventually. Horses could not run forever, and men made mistakes when they thought themselves safe. By nightfall, he had covered perhaps 12 miles, and the trail was still clear enough that he risked a cold camp in a hollow between 2 ridges. He did not light a fire. He ate dried meat and drank sparingly from his water skin, then lay on his back and stared at the stars that were just beginning to prick through the twilight. Somewhere under this same sky, Priya was bound and frightened, surrounded by men who saw her as nothing more than coin to be collected. The thought made his jaw ache from clenching. He had met her 8 months ago at a trade fair in the border market where her clan brought metalwork to sell. She had been manning her family's stall, demonstrating the balance of a kitchen knife to a skeptical farm wife. And Ethan had stopped to watch because he needed a new hatchet, and because the green-skinned woman, arguing the merits of proper tang construction, had a laugh that carried across 3 rows of stalls. He had bought the hatchet. They had talked while she wrapped it. He had come back the next day with a question about sharpening angles that he already knew the answer to, just to hear her laugh again. The courtship had been slow and complicated by the fact that humans and orcs did not often marry, and those who tried faced suspicion from both sides. Priya's family had been wary of Ethan's intentions, her father watching him with the kind of protective intensity that only a man with daughters understood. Ethan's neighbors had been less cautious and more openly hostile, asking him if he had lost his mind, suggesting that no good could come from such a match. He had ignored them all with the same quiet stubbornness that had gotten him through the lean years after his father's death. And eventually, Priya's family had warmed to him when they saw he was serious, that he treated their daughter with respect, that he listened when she talked about her work at the forge and asked real questions instead of just nodding. He had proposed on a spring evening after helping her repair a broken wagon axle, both of them covered in grease and laughing at some joke he could not even remember now. She had said yes immediately, then kissed him in front of half her clan, tusks cool against his lips, and the memory of it was bright enough that he could almost feel it now in the dark. He slept poorly and woke before dawn with dew soaking through his blanket. The stars were fading to gray, and the first birds were starting to call when he saddled his horse and took up the trail again. The second day was harder. The raiders had reached the hills, and the ground turned to rock and sparse grass that held tracks poorly. Ethan dismounted and led his horse, reading the land with his eyes an inch from the ground, looking for the scrape of an iron shoe on limestone, the scatter of small stones where a hoof had dislodged them, the bent stem of a thorn bush where a rider had passed too close. The sun climbed and the temperature rose and the water in his skin grew warm and stale tasting. By midday, he had covered perhaps 4 miles, a crawl compared to yesterday's pace, and the frustration was a living thing in his chest. He was crouched over a patch of dirt, trying to decide if the smudge there was a hoofprint or just wind erosion, when he heard the voice behind him. "You track like a human." Ethan spun, hand going to his knife, and found himself facing an orc woman standing 10 feet away with a recurve bow held loosely in one hand. She was older than Priya, perhaps 30, with scars crossing her forearms and a look in her eyes that said she had seen things that left marks deeper than skin. Her skin was a darker green than Priya's, more olive than grass, and her tusks were filed to points. She wore leather armor that had been patched many times and a cloak the color of dead grass. "That is because I am human," Ethan said, straightening slowly. "I can see that." She tilted her head, studying him with the same expression his father had worn when evaluating a horse. "You are following the raiders who took the Clearwater girl." It was not a question, but Ethan answered anyway. "Yes." "Why?" "She is my betrothed." The orc woman made a sound that might have been surprise or approval, hard to tell. "I am Kessa. I scout for the clans in this region. The Clearwaters asked me to ride out when word reached them that Priya was taken." Ethan felt something in his chest ease slightly, just a fraction. "How far ahead are they?" "Half a day, maybe less. They stopped for water at the Red Spring this morning, then headed east toward the old fort ruins." Kessa slung her bow across her back and moved closer, her steps making no sound on the stone. "They are led by a man named Garrett Stone. He runs a small gang, mostly ransom work and supply theft. He will not kill her unless pressed, but he will not treat her gently either." "I know." Ethan turned to look east, shading his eyes against the sun. "Have you tracked them before?" "Twice. Once I got the captive back. Once I did not." Kessa's voice was flat. "Stone is clever and he knows this country. If you go in alone, you will fail." Ethan met her eyes, reading the challenge there. "Are you offering to help?" "Priya's father paid me to find her. He did not pay me to like you." Kessa's expression did not change. "But I know you." The Clearwaters talked about the human man who courted their daughter properly, who showed up with gifts and worked beside them and did not flinch when her brothers tested him. "If you are that man, I will help. If you are a fool riding to his death, I will report your body to your kin and continue alone." "I am that man," Ethan said quietly, "and I will bring her home." Kessa studied him a moment longer, then nodded once. "Then we ride together. Keep up." She turned and whistled, and a gray horse appeared from behind a rock outcrop as if conjured. Kessa swung into the saddle with the easy grace of someone who had been riding since childhood, and Ethan mounted his own horse and followed her east into the hills. The miles passed faster with Kessa leading. She knew the country and she rode like part of the landscape, choosing paths that kept them off the skyline and moving at a steady pace that ate distance without exhausting the horses. They stopped once to water the animals at a seep that Ethan would have ridden past without seeing, and while the horses drank, Kessa studied the ground and pointed out the signs he had been missing. 4 riders, one carrying double weight. They passed through here 3 hours ago, maybe 4. She indicated a hoofprint in the mud at the water's edge. "This one is Stone's horse. I know the shoe. The farrier in Gray Ridge puts in that extra nail on the left side. The others are hired men, probably locals who know the area but not well enough to lose us completely." Ethan committed the print to memory, filing it away with all the other small details that might matter later. "Where are they going?" "The fort ruins are another 8 miles east. It is a good place to hole up, water and shelter, and you can see anyone coming from a long way off." Kessa straightened and wiped her hands on her cloak. "If they plan to send a ransom demand, they will do it from there." "Who will they send it to?" "Priya's family, most likely. Maybe yours if they know you." Kessa glanced at him, measuring. "How much can you raise?" Ethan thought of his farm, the modest savings he had put aside, the few things of value he owned. Enough to get their attention, not enough to satisfy them. "That is what I thought." Kessa swung back into the saddle. Then we will need a better plan than coin. They rode on as the sun slid toward the western horizon, the shadows growing long and the air cooling to something almost comfortable. Ethan's mind was turning over possibilities, plans that all seemed to end with variables he could not control. He had never been a violent man by nature, had avoided the fights that other young men sought out, but he had learned to use a bow from his father, and he was strong from years of farm work. If it came to it, he would fight. He would do whatever was necessary. But he was not fool enough to think 4 armed raiders would fall to him alone, even with Kessa's help. They needed an edge, something to turn the odds in their favor. He was still puzzling over it when Kessa reined in suddenly and held up one hand. Ethan stopped beside her, following her gaze. Ahead the land dropped away into a shallow valley, and on the far side the ruins of an old border fort crowned a low rise. The walls were mostly intact, gray stone weathered smooth by decades of wind, and smoke rose from somewhere inside the courtyard. Even from this distance, Ethan could see the horses picketed outside the gate, 4 of them, and the glint of metal that might have been weapons or armor catching the last of the daylight. "There," Kessa said softly. "They are settling in for the night." Ethan felt his heart kick up a notch. Priya was down there, somewhere inside those walls, close enough to reach, but the distance might as well have been miles for all the good it did him while they held the high ground and the numbers. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to think instead of just react. "We cannot take them by force," he said, more to himself than to Kessa. "No," she agreed, "but we can watch and wait and look for weakness. Men make mistakes when they feel safe." They withdrew to a sheltered spot behind a ridge where they could see the fort without being seen. And as the sun set, Ethan watched the ruins with the same patient intensity he used when waiting for deer to come to water. Kessa sat beside him, equally still, her eyes missing nothing. At some point, she passed him a strip of dried meat, and he ate it without tasting, his focus locked on the distant walls. Full dark came and a fire bloomed inside the fort courtyard, the light flickering against the stone. Ethan could see shadows moving, hear the faint sound of voices on the wind, but nothing clear enough to make out words or numbers. He thought about Priya down there, about whether they had untied her hands, whether they had given her food or water, whether she was hurt. The not knowing was worse than anything he could imagine. "Tell me about her," Kessa said suddenly, her voice low. Ethan glanced at her, surprised. "What, Priya? Tell me about her." Kessa was still watching the fort, her expression unreadable. "I have met her a few times at clan gatherings, but I do not know her well. Tell me why a human man would cross the hills alone to get her back." Ethan was quiet for a moment, searching for words that could hold the shape of what he felt. "She is clever," he said finally. "She sees how things work, the structure underneath. She can look at a broken tool and know immediately what is wrong and how to fix it. She has strong opinions about everything from how to temper steel to the best way to plant potatoes, and she will argue her point until you are half convinced she is right even when you know she is not." Kessa made a sound that might have been amusement. "She laughs easily," Ethan continued, the words coming smoother now. "At small things, at herself, at me when I am being overly serious. She works harder than anyone I have ever met, and she is kind in the way that matters, not the empty courtesy of people who say nice things but do not mean them. When my neighbor's barn burned last spring, she was the first one there to help rebuild, even though that neighbor had said things about her that would make most people walk away." He paused, looking down at his hands. "She chose me. Out of all the people she could have had, all the safer choices, she chose me, and I will not let her down." Kessa was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "You love her." "Yes," Ethan said simply. Then we will get her back. Kessa stood and brushed off her cloak. Rest now. I will take first watch. When the moon is high, we will move closer and see what we can learn. Ethan lay down on the hard ground and closed his eyes, but sleep was a long time coming. The moon was a bright coin overhead when Kessa shook him awake. Ethan came alert immediately, the habit of years rising with the livestock. The night was cool and quiet, the stars thick overhead, and the fire in the fort had burned down to coals that cast only a faint red glow against the walls. Now, Kessa whispered. They moved down the slope in silence, keeping to the shadows and the low ground. Ethan's heart was loud in his ears, but his hands were steady, his father's training taking over in the places where fear tried to root. They reached the base of the rise and circled around to the east side of the fort where the wall had partially collapsed, leaving a gap barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Kessa slipped through first, and Ethan followed, his shoulders scraping stone on both sides. Inside, the courtyard was mostly open space, with the remains of a few buildings along the walls and a covered well in the center. The raiders had set up camp in what had once been the main hall, a structure with 3 walls and part of a roof still intact. Ethan could see the shapes of men sleeping near the coals of the fire, wrapped in blankets. 4 men, as Kessa had said. He scanned the space looking for Priya and found her finally in the far corner, sitting with her back against the wall, her hands still bound in front of her. Even from across the courtyard, he could see that she was awake, her eyes reflecting the dim firelight. She had not seen them yet, her attention on the sleeping raiders, and Ethan felt relief and fear in equal measure. She was alive, she was whole, but she was also guarded and tied and 20 feet away across open ground. Kessa touched his arm and gestured toward the gate. A 5th man was standing watch there, leaning against the stone with a spear in one hand, his head nodding slightly. Not fully asleep, but close enough that he might not react quickly if startled. Ethan nodded and pointed at Priya, then at himself, the meaning clear. Kessa hesitated, then nodded once and began to slide along the wall toward the gate guard, moving like smoke. Ethan went the other direction, keeping to the shadows, his eyes on the sleeping men. One of them stirred and rolled over, and Ethan froze until the man settled again. Then he kept moving, inch by inch, until he was at the edge of the ruined hall. From here he could see Priya more clearly. She had a bruise darkening on her cheek and her dress was torn at the shoulder, but her eyes were sharp and alert. As he watched, she turned her head slightly and saw him. Her eyes went wide. Her mouth opened as if to speak, and Ethan quickly raised one finger to his lips. She closed her mouth and nodded, her expression shifting from surprise to something that looked like hope and fury mixed together. Ethan pointed at her bonds, then mimed cutting them, and she nodded again. But before he could move, one of the sleeping men coughed and sat up, rubbing his face. Ethan melted back into the shadows, his heart hammering. The man stood and stretched, then walked over to where Priya sat and looked down at her. Ethan could not hear what he said, but Priya turned her face away and the man laughed. He walked past her to the well and drew up a bucket of water, drank deeply, then went back to his bedroll and lay down again. Ethan waited, counting his breaths, until the man's breathing evened out into the rhythm of sleep. Then he moved forward again, faster this time, until he was crouched beside Priya. She was trembling, he realized, either from cold or fear or rage, and he reached out and touched her bound hands. Her skin was cool and her fingers wrapped around his immediately, squeezing hard. He pulled his knife and sawed through the rope binding her wrists, the blade sharp enough that it took only seconds. The moment she was free, Priya grabbed his face with both hands and kissed him hard, her tusks pressing against his cheeks, her breath shaky. He kissed her back, tasting blood and dust and relief, then pulled away and gestured toward the gap in the wall. They moved together, staying low, Priya's hand locked in his. They were halfway across the courtyard when someone shouted. Ethan did not look back. He shoved Priya toward the gap and turned, drawing his knife, putting himself between her and whoever was coming. The gate guard was running toward them, spear leveled, and behind him the sleeping men were scrambling up. Kessa appeared out of nowhere and slammed into the guard from the side, her own knife flashing, and the spear clattered away across the stone. "Go," Kessa shouted. Ethan grabbed Priya's hand again and hauled her through the gap in the wall. She stumbled and he caught her, and then they were running down the slope toward the valley floor, the sound of shouting and steel on steel echoing behind them. Ethan's lungs burned and his legs felt like wood, but he did not stop, did not slow, until they reached the hollow where they had left the horses. Priya collapsed against his saddle, gasping for air, and Ethan turned back toward the fort, searching the darkness for any sign of pursuit or of Kessa. The shouting had stopped. The night was quiet again except for Priya's ragged breathing and the nervous stamping of the horses. Then Kessa appeared out of the dark, running low and fast, and slid down the slope to join them. She had blood on her knife and a cut across her forearm that was bleeding freely. "Mount up," she said. "They will be coming." Ethan boosted Priya onto his horse and swung up behind her, and Kessa vaulted onto her own mount. They rode west at a gallop, the horses stretching out beneath them, the ground blurring past. Ethan wrapped one arm around Priya's waist to keep her steady, and she leaned back against him, her weight solid and real and alive. They rode until the horses were blowing hard and the fort was miles behind them. Then Kessa reined in and led them into a narrow canyon where a trickle of water ran over stone. They dismounted and Ethan finally got a good look at Priya in the moonlight. The bruise on her face was worse than he had thought, swelling purple and black, and there were rope burns on her wrists. Her dress was filthy and torn and she was shaking, but her eyes were clear. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his hands on her shoulders. "No," she said, her voice rough. "No, they did not. I thought." And then she stopped and grabbed him and held on, her face pressed against his chest, her body shaking harder now. Ethan wrapped his arms around her and held her while she cried silent heaving sobs that felt like they might break her in half. He did not say anything, just held her and let her feel whatever she needed to feel. Kessa was tending to her horse and her wounded arm, giving them space. When Priya finally pulled back, wiping at her face with dirty hands, Kessa came over and offered her a water skin. "Drink," she said. Priya drank, long swallows that made her throat work, then handed the skin back. "Thank you, both of you." "Do not thank me yet," Kessa said. "They will be tracking us now and Stone does not give up easy. We need to put more distance between us and them before we rest." "Can we outrun them?" Ethan asked. "Maybe, but we are 2 horses carrying 3 people and they are 4 horses carrying 4 people. The numbers are not in our favor." Kessa tied off the bandage on her arm with her teeth. "We need to make them not want to follow." "How?" Priya asked. Kessa looked at Ethan. "You said you did not have enough coin to satisfy them. How much do you have?" Ethan thought of the small pouch in his saddlebag, the money he had brought for the wedding journey. 30 silver, maybe a bit more. That will not buy you a horse, much less a captive." Kessa frowned, thinking. "But it might buy you a conversation." "What do you mean?" Priya asked. "Stone is a businessman before he is a killer. If we can make him believe that he will get paid but that chasing us will cost him more than we are worth, he might let it go." Kessa looked between them. "It is a risk. He might just take the money and kill us, but it is better than running until the horses die." Ethan felt Priya tense beside him, and he took her hand. "What do you think?" I think I do not want to go back to those men, Priya said quietly, but I also do not want to die running. If there is a chance to end this, we should take it. Ethan looked at Kessa. How do we make this happen? We let them catch up, Kessa said. But on our terms, in a place where we have the advantage. I know a spot about 5 miles west, a box canyon with only one way in. We take position there and wait. When they come, we negotiate from high ground. It was a gamble, and Ethan knew it. But they were all gambling at this point, betting their lives on choices that had no good options. He thought of his father, who had once told him that the difference between bravery and stupidity was whether you had a plan. He hoped this counted as a plan. All right, he said. Let us do it. They rode west again, slower now, conserving the horses. The moon was sliding toward the horizon when Kessa led them into a narrow canyon with walls that rose steep and sheer on 3 sides. A trickle of water ran down the back wall, pooling at the base, and there were a few scattered boulders that would provide cover. It was not much, but it was better than open ground. Kessa positioned them behind the boulders with a clear view of the canyon entrance, and they settled in to wait. Ethan strung his bow and checked his arrows, and Kessa did the same. Priya found a rock the size of her fist and weighed it in her hand, her jaw set. They did not talk. There was nothing left to say that had not already been said with the fact that they were here together, ready to fight or die or somehow talk their way out of this mess. The sun rose slowly, painting the canyon walls gold and red. Ethan's eyes felt grainy from lack of sleep and his body ached from 2 days in the saddle, but he kept his focus on the entrance, his bow ready. Beside him, Priya was equally still, her eyes on the same spot. I am sorry, he said quietly. She looked at him, surprised. For what? For not protecting you at the river, for letting them take you. Priya's expression softened and she reached over and touched his face. You are here now. That is what matters. I should have been faster, should have seen them coming. Ethan. She turned his face to look at her fully. You tracked me through country you barely know, with no help and no guarantee you would find me alive. You came anyway. Do not apologize for that. He held her gaze, reading the truth there, and nodded slowly. There were things he wanted to say, feelings he had held close because he was not a man who spoke easily about such things, but the words stuck in his throat. Priya seemed to understand anyway because she leaned in and kissed him gently, her tusks cool against his skin. I know, she whispered. I know. Kessa made a small sound and they broke apart. She was looking toward the canyon entrance, her body tense. Ethan followed her gaze and saw the riders appearing at the mouth of the canyon, 4 of them, moving slowly and carefully. The man in front was the gray, bearded raider who had held the crossbow on Ethan at the river, Garrett Stone, and he raised one hand when he saw them behind the boulders. Hold, he called, his voice echoing off the stone. We just want to talk. Then talk, Kessa shouted back. From there. Stone reined in his horse and sat easy in the saddle, his hands visible and empty. The other 3 riders fanned out slightly behind him, also careful to keep their hands where they could be seen. Ethan kept his bow half drawn, the string taut under his fingers. You have something of mine, Stone said. I would like it back. She is not yours, Ethan called. She is my betrothed and you took her unlawfully. Unlawfully. Stone seemed to find that funny. Son, there is no law out here but what we make. I took her because someone would pay to get her back. That is how this works. No one will pay you, Kessa said. Her family has no coin to spare, and his family has even less. You made a bad bet, Stone. Cut your losses and walk away. Stone tilted his head, considering. Maybe. Or maybe I sell her to someone who does not care about ransom, who wants an orc girl for other reasons. There are markets for such things. Ethan felt something dark and cold move through him. His bow came up the rest of the way, arrow nocked and aimed at Stone's chest. "You will not touch her." "Easy," Stone said, his hands still visible. "Like I said, we are here to talk." "What will you give me to walk away clean?" 30 silver, Ethan said. Stone laughed, a genuine belly laugh that made his horse shift beneath him. 30 silver? Boy, that will not even cover my expenses for this trip." "Then tell me your price," Ethan said, "and I will find a way to get it." "My price is 100 silver, and I want it within the week." Ethan felt his heart sink. 100 silver was more than he could raise in a year, even if he sold everything he owned. Stone knew it too, reading the answer on his face. "That is what I thought," Stone said. "So here is what is going to happen. You are going to give me the girl and the 30 silver you have now, and I am going to forget I ever saw you. You walk away, I get what I am owed everyone lives." "Good deal, yes." "No," Priya said, her voice cutting across the canyon. She stood up from behind the boulder, ignoring Ethan's attempt to pull her back down. "You do not get to decide my future. I am not property." Stone looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Girl, you do not have much say in this." "Actually, I do." Priya walked forward a few steps, her chin up. "I am Priya Clearwater, daughter of Torrin Clearwater, master smith of the Red Stone clan. My family has ties to every orc settlement within 50 miles, and if you harm me, they will come for you. Not just my father, not just my brothers, but every smith and scout and warrior who owes my family a debt, and they will not stop until they find you." Stone's expression flickered, just slightly. Ethan saw it and felt a small spark of hope. "My betrothed has 30 silver," Priya continued, her voice steady. "I will add 20 silver of my own, and we will swear on whatever oath you choose that no one will come after you for what has already happened. You will have 50 silver, which is more than you would get selling me to slavers after you paid their cut, and you will have peace with the Red Stone clan. Or you can refuse and spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder." The canyon was silent except for the sound of water trickling down the back wall. Stone sat his horse, looking at Priya with an expression that might have been respect or might have been calculation. Then he glanced at his men, at the canyon walls, at the bows Ethan and Kessa were holding, and seemed to come to a decision. 50 silver, he said, and an oath sworn before witness. "Agreed," Priya said immediately. "And you," Stone looked at Ethan, "swear that you and yours will not come after me or mine." "I swear it," Ethan said. "On my father's name," Stone nodded slowly. "All right, bring the coin to the canyon entrance, slow." Ethan lowered his bow carefully and reached into his saddlebag, pulling out the small leather pouch that held his savings. Priya came back to the boulder and produced her own pouch from inside her torn dress, 20 silver coins that clinked softly as she poured them into his hand. He looked at her, surprised. "I always carry it," she said quietly, "in case I need to make a fast deal or, well, something like this." Ethan walked forward slowly, his hands visible, the coins heavy in his palm. He stopped halfway between the boulders and the canyon entrance, set the pouches on the ground, and backed away. Stone dismounted and walked forward, equally slow, and picked up the money. He weighed the pouches in his hand, opened one and checked the coins, then nodded. "Pleasure doing business," he said, and there was something almost like humor in his voice. He remounted and looked at his men. "We are done here." They turned their horses and rode out of the canyon without looking back. Ethan watched them until they disappeared around the bend, then turned to find Priya standing beside him, her hand slipping into his. "Is it over?" she asked quietly. "Yes," Ethan said, and the relief that washed through him made his knees weak. "It is over." Kessa came down from the boulders, her bow still in hand. "You did well," she said to Priya. "That was quick thinking." I just said what he needed to hear, Priya said. Men like that care about profit and risk. We made the risk too high. Still, Kessa said, well done. She looked at Ethan. I will ride with you back to the river crossing, make sure Stone keeps his word. After that, you are on your own. I have other work to do. Thank you, Ethan said, for everything. Kessa nodded once, her expression unreadable, then went to tend to her horse. Ethan turned to Priya and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly enough that he felt her ribs flex under his hands. She held him back just as hard, her face pressed against his neck. I thought I lost you, he said, and his voice cracked on the words. You did not, she said. You found me. You brought me home. They stood there for a long moment, holding each other while the sun rose higher and warmed the canyon walls. Then Priya pulled back and looked up at him, her green eyes serious. When we were at the river and they took me, I thought about all the things I never said to you, she said. All the times I wanted to tell you how I felt, but I was too proud or too scared or too something. And I promised myself that if I got another chance, I would not waste it. Ethan waited, his heart in his throat. I love you, Priya said, and her voice was steady and clear. I have loved you since the day you came back to the market stall with a question you already knew the answer to, just to talk to me. I love your patience and your kindness, and the way you listen when I talk about metal tempering like it is the most interesting thing in the world. I love that you crossed the hills alone to get me back, that you never hesitated, that you are standing here now looking at me like I am the only thing that matters. I love you, Ethan Prescott, and I want to marry you and build a life with you and grow old arguing about potato planting and everything else. Ethan felt something break open in his chest, something that had been locked away for so long he had almost forgotten it was there. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing over her cheeks, and when he spoke his voice was rough. I love you too, he said. I have loved you from the beginning and I will love you until the end. Everything I have, everything I am, it is yours, always. He kissed her then, deep and slow, tasting salt and dust and the promise of everything yet to come. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Priya was smiling, her tusks bright in the morning light. We should get married, she said, as soon as possible, before anything else tries to stop us. Ethan laughed, the sound startling him with its lightness. Yes, let us do that. They rode west with Kessa, retracing the path that Ethan had followed in desperate pursuit just 2 days past. The journey felt different now, lighter somehow despite the exhaustion and the aches and the dried blood on their clothes. Priya rode in front of Ethan, her back pressed against his chest, her hands resting on his arms where they wrapped around her waist. They talked sometimes, in quiet voices, about small things and large things, and all the things they had been too afraid to say before. Mostly they just rode in comfortable silence, feeling the solid reality of being together and alive. They reached the river crossing at sunset on the 3rd day, and found Priya's family waiting there with a dozen clan members and enough weapons to start a small war. Her father, Torin Clearwater, was a mountain of an orc with shoulders like an ox and hands scarred from decades at the forge. He took one look at his daughter and his face crumpled, all the fierce warrior strength melting into pure relief. Priya slid down from the horse and ran to him, and he caught her in a hug that lifted her off the ground. Her mother was there too, smaller and sharp-eyed, and she folded Priya into her arms and held her while her father kept one hand on his daughter's shoulder as if to prove she was real. Ethan dismounted and stood back, giving them space, but Torin's eyes found him after a moment. The big orc released his daughter and walked over to Ethan, and for a heartbeat, Ethan thought he might be about to get hit. Instead, Torin grabbed his hand and squeezed hard enough that bones ground together. "You brought her home," Torrin said, and his voice was thick. "I did," Ethan said simply. "Then you have my thanks and my respect and anything else I can give you." Torrin looked at him with eyes that were suspiciously wet. "You are a good man, Ethan Prescott. My daughter chose well." "I think I am the one who chose well," Ethan said, and meant it. They made camp at the river that night, and Priya told her family everything that had happened while they listened with expressions that ranged from rage to relief to pride. Kessa added details where needed, describing the chase and the negotiations and the way Priya had faced down stone with nothing but words and will. When the story was done, Torrin announced that the wedding would happen immediately, before the week was out, with all the clan gathered to witness. "No more waiting," he said firmly. "No more delays. If my daughter wants to marry this man, then we will make it so and let anyone who objects try to stop us." Priya looked at Ethan, her eyebrows raised in question. Ethan nodded, smiling. 3 days from now," Torrin said. "At the Red Stone Settlement. We will have a feast and a proper ceremony, and you will be wed before gods and clan and anyone else who cares to watch." Those 3 days passed in a blur of preparation and travel. They rode north to the Red Stone Settlement, a collection of stone and timber buildings built into the side of a rocky hill, with forges that glowed red at all hours and the sound of hammering that never quite stopped. Ethan had visited once before during the courtship, but now he was welcomed not as a curious outsider but as family, and the difference was profound. Priya's brothers clapped him on the back and challenged him to drinking contests he wisely declined. Her cousins showed him the workshops and explained the craft of the forge with the enthusiasm of people who loved their work. Her mother fed him until he thought he might burst, and her father gave him a tour of the settlement that ended at the forge where Priya worked. "She is the best of us," Torrin said, watching the glow of the coals. "Better than me at her age, and I was good. She understands metal the way some people understand music, hearing the notes that others miss. When she was 10, she made a knife that I still use because I have never found better." "I know," Ethan said quietly. "I have seen her work." "Then you know what you are getting," Torrin said, and clapped him on the shoulder hard enough to make him stagger. "She will keep you busy, and she will never let you settle for less than your best, and she will love you with everything she has." It is a good match. The day of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the late summer air warm but not oppressive. The ceremony was to be held in the main square of the settlement, under an arch of woven willow branches that Priya's cousins had constructed overnight. Ethan woke early in the guest house where he had been staying, and found his hands shaking as he dressed in the good clothes he had packed for the wedding journey all those days ago. They were rumpled and travel-stained, but Priya's mother had taken them and cleaned and pressed them, and now they looked almost new. He walked out into the square and found it already filling with people, orcs and humans both, more than he had expected. Apparently word had spread about the wedding between the human man and the orc woman, and people had come from the surrounding settlements to witness it. Ethan felt a flutter of nerves in his stomach, but when he saw Priya's father waiting under the arch with a broad smile, he felt himself steady. The ceremony was brief and beautiful. Priya appeared from her family's home wearing a dress the color of deep red wine, with embroidery in silver thread that caught the light. Her hair was braided and pinned with small metal flowers that she had made herself, and when she walked toward Ethan through the crowd, he forgot how to breathe. They stood together under the arch while a clan elder spoke words in the old tongue that Ethan did not fully understand but felt the weight of. They exchanged vows, simple and direct, promising to stand by each other in good times and hard times, to build a life together, to love and honor each other until death parted them. Ethan spoke his vows clearly, his eyes on Priya, and when she spoke hers, her voice was steady and strong. They exchanged rings, simple bands of steel that Priya had forged herself, and when the elder pronounced them, the crowd erupted in cheers. Ethan kissed his wife, feeling her smile against his lips, and the world narrowed to just the two of them for one perfect moment before the celebration swallowed them up. The feast that followed was a raucous affair with food and drink and music that lasted well into the night. Ethan danced with Priya in the square, both of them laughing and stumbling over unfamiliar steps, and later he danced with her mother and her cousins and even Kessa, who appeared briefly to offer her congratulations before disappearing back into the night. Torin made a speech that was equal parts sentimental and embarrassing, and Priya hid her face against Ethan's shoulder while the crowd roared with laughter. As the evening wore on and the crowd began to thin, Ethan and Priya slipped away to the small house that her family had prepared for them at the edge of the settlement. It was modest but well built, with a hearth and a bed and windows that looked out over the valley. They stood in the doorway together, looking at their new home, and Ethan felt a sense of rightness settle over him. "Are you happy?" Priya asked softly. "Yes," Ethan said and pulled her close. "More than I knew I could be." They went inside and closed the door on the rest of the world. The next morning they woke tangled together in the bed, sunlight streaming through the windows and the sound of the settlement coming to life outside. Priya stretched and yawned, her tusks catching the light, and Ethan watched her with a contentment that felt almost too large to contain. "What are you thinking?" she asked, catching him staring. "That I am a very lucky man," he said. "You are," she agreed with a grin, "but I am lucky too." They lay there for a while longer, talking quietly about their plans. Ethan would need to return to his farm eventually to harvest the late crops and prepare for winter, and Priya would need to finish the commissions she had taken before the wedding journey. But they would do it together now, building a life that spanned both their worlds, creating something new that belonged to them alone. "I have been thinking," Priya said, tracing patterns on his chest with one finger. "About the farm. It is a good place, but it is far from my family. And your house is small for two people, especially if we, decide to have children someday." Ethan felt his heart kick at that thought, but he kept his voice steady. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting we build a new house. Somewhere between your farm and the settlement, close enough to both that we can visit easily but far enough that we have our own space. A place that is ours from the beginning." Ethan considered that, turning it over in his mind. It would be hard work, building a house from nothing, but he had strong hands and Priya had the skills to forge whatever tools they needed. And the idea of creating something together, a home that they designed and built with their own labor, appealed to him deeply. "I like that idea," he said. "Let us do it." They spent the next few weeks planning and preparing. Ethan returned to his farm to harvest what he could and settle his affairs, and Priya worked in the forge to create the nails and hinges and fittings they would need. They found a spot of land halfway between the farm and the settlement, a gentle slope with good water and timber nearby, and they began to build. The work was hard but satisfying. Ethan felled trees and shaped them into logs, and Priya used her knowledge of structure and engineering to design a house that was solid and efficient. They worked from dawn until dusk, with help from Priya's brothers and cousins on the heavy lifts, and slowly the house took shape. It was not large, just 3 rooms and a loft, but it was well made and it was theirs. One evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the valley, Priya leaned against Ethan's shoulder and sighed contentedly. "You ever think about that day at the river?" she asked. "About what would have happened if you had waited for help instead of coming after me?" "Yes," Ethan said quietly. "I think about it sometimes." "And And I am glad I did not wait. I am glad I went after you, even though it was reckless and probably stupid." He looked down at her, his hand finding hers. "I would do it again, 100 times over." Priya squeezed his hand. "I know. That is why I love you." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear overhead, and Ethan thought about all the paths that had led them to this moment. The chance meeting at the market, the slow courtship, the proposal, the capture and rescue, the wedding. Each step had been a choice, a decision to move forward together despite the obstacles and the doubts and the voices that said it could not work. But it had worked. They had made it work, and now they were here, building a life together in a house they had made with their own hands. It was not the story Ethan had imagined when he was younger, but it was better than anything he could have dreamed up on his own. The house was finished by the time the first snow fell, and they moved in with a few pieces of furniture and a lot of hope. Priya set up a small forge in the yard where she could work on commissions, and Ethan cleared land for a larger garden and a field for next year's crops. They learned to live together, navigating the small adjustments and compromises that any marriage required, and they found that they fit together well, their strengths covering each other's weaknesses. Winter was hard that year, with deep snows and bitter cold, but they weathered it together, keeping the fire burning and telling stories on the long, dark evenings. Priya taught Ethan some of the old clan songs, and he taught her the ballads his father had sung when he was young. They read books by candlelight and made plans for the spring, and on the coldest nights, they huddled together under piles of blankets and felt grateful for the warmth of another body. When spring came, the land thawed and greened, and they planted a garden that Priya insisted would be the finest in the region. Ethan had his doubts, but he kept them to himself and worked beside her, digging rows and dropping seeds and covering them carefully. The garden thrived under their care, and by summer they had more vegetables than they could eat, which Priya brought to the settlement to trade for other goods. One afternoon in late summer, Priya came in from the forge looking tired but pleased. She sat down heavily at the table and Ethan poured her a cup of water, which she drank gratefully. "I finished the commission for the wheelwright in Greystone," she said. 3 dozen wagon fittings, all perfectly matched. He will be pleased." "That is good work," Ethan said. "You should rest." "I will." She looked at him, her expression suddenly serious. "I have something to tell you." Ethan felt his stomach tighten. "What is it?" "I am pregnant," Priya said, and her voice was a mix of excitement and nervousness. "About 2 months along, I think." "I have been waiting to be sure before I said anything." Ethan stared at her, the words not quite landing. Then they did, and he felt a wave of emotion so strong it left him dizzy. He knelt beside her chair and took her hands, looking up at her face. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Yes," she said, smiling now. "I am certain." "That is," he stopped, searching for words. "That is wonderful. That is the best news." Priya laughed and pulled him up to kiss him. "I thought you would be happy." "Happy does not begin to cover it," Ethan said, and he realized there were tears on his face. He did not bother to wipe them away. "We are going to have a child." "We are," Priya agreed, and she was crying too, happy tears that caught the light from the window. "We are going to be parents." They held each other for a long moment, letting the reality of it settle over them. Then Ethan pulled back and looked at her seriously. "You need to take it easy," he said. "No more heavy lifting, no more long days at the forge." "Ethan," Priya said patiently, "I am pregnant, not made of glass. I can still work. I know, but no buts. I will be careful, I promise, but I am not going to stop living my life just because there is a baby coming." She softened and touched his face. "I appreciate your concern, but trust me, I know what I can handle." Ethan nodded, though he suspected he would still worry every moment until the child was safely born. But that was his burden to carry, and Priya was right that she knew her own limits. The months passed, and Priya's belly grew round and full. She worked at the forge until she could no longer comfortably reach the anvil, and then she switched to smaller projects she could do sitting down. Ethan took over the heavier tasks and tried not to hover too obviously, though he suspected he failed at that more often than not. Priya bore his concern with good humor, teasing him gently when he fussed too much. They prepared the loft as a nursery, building a cradle from smooth oak and sewing blankets from soft wool. Priya's mother came to visit and brought gifts from the clan, tiny clothes and toys, and advice that Priya listened to with varying degrees of patience. Ethan's neighbors, the ones who had been skeptical of his marriage, came by with their own gifts and awkward congratulations, and Ethan realized that the birth of a child had softened even the hardest hearts. The baby came on a cold night in early spring, after a labor that lasted most of a day and left Priya exhausted but fiercely proud. The midwife, an older orc woman from the settlement, placed the baby in Priya's arms and pronounced her healthy and strong. Ethan knelt beside the bed and looked at his daughter, this tiny perfect person with green skin, a shade lighter than her mother's and a dusting of dark hair on her head, and felt his heart expand in ways he had not known were possible. "What should we name her?" Priya asked, her voice rough from exertion. Ethan thought for a moment, then smiled. "Greta, after my grandmother." Priya looked down at the baby, considering. "Greta Prescott, I like it. It is strong." "Like her mother," Ethan said, and kissed Priya's forehead. The months that followed were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Greta was a healthy baby with a loud cry and a strong appetite, and she kept them both busy day and night. Ethan learned to change diapers and soothe a crying infant, and Priya learned to feed the baby while simultaneously working on forged designs with one hand. They took turns walking the floor when Greta would not sleep, and they marveled together at every small milestone, every smile and coo and new skill. Priya's family visited often, bringing gifts and advice and eager hands to hold the baby. Torin was particularly smitten with his granddaughter, spending hours just holding her and singing old clan songs in a surprisingly gentle voice. Ethan's neighbors came too, and slowly the barriers that had existed between human and orc began to break down, replaced by the universal understanding that babies were babies, regardless of their skin color or the shape of their ears. When Greta was 6 months old, Ethan and Priya took her to visit both the settlement and the farm, introducing her to the two worlds she would grow up between. She was passed from hand to hand, admired and cooed over, and Ethan felt a deep satisfaction knowing that his daughter would grow up surrounded by love from both sides of her heritage. One evening, after they had returned home and put Greta to bed, Ethan and Priya sat on the porch watching the stars come out. The air was warm and smelled of growing things, and somewhere in the distance, a night bird was calling. "Do you remember the day we met?" Priya asked suddenly. "At the market," Ethan said. "You were arguing with a customer about knife balance. You bought the hatchet." "I did. I still have it. It is a good hatchet," Priya smiled. "And you came back the next day with a question you already knew the answer to." "I wanted to see you again," Ethan admitted. "I did not know what else to do." "It worked," Priya said, leaning against his shoulder. Here we are," Ethan agreed. He wrapped his arm around her and looked out at the land they had built their life on, the house they had made together, the family they had created. It was not the path he had expected his life to take, but it was the path he was grateful for every single day. "I love you," he said quietly. "I love you too," Priya said. "Always." They sat there together as the stars wheeled overhead and the night settled around them, two people who had chosen each other against the odds and built something beautiful in the process. And in the house behind them, their daughter slept peacefully, safe and loved, the promise of everything yet to come. Years passed, and their life together deepened and grew. Greta grew into a bright and curious child with her mother's sharp mind and her father's steady temperament. She learned to work metal at her mother's side and to raid the land at her father's, and she moved between the settlement and the human communities with an ease that gave Ethan hope for the future. When Greta was 3, Priya became pregnant again, and this time they welcomed a son they named Paul after Ethan's father. Paul was quieter than his sister, more thoughtful, with eyes that seemed to take in everything and a gentle nature that drew people to him. The house felt full and loud and chaotic in the best possible way, and Ethan often found himself standing in the doorway just watching his family with a sense of profound gratitude. The forge prospered, and Priya's reputation as a master smith spread throughout the region. People came from distant settlements to commission her work, and she trained apprentices who carried her techniques back to their own communities. Ethan expanded the farm, clearing more land and bringing in better tools, and together they built a life that was comfortable and secure. But it was not the material success that mattered most to Ethan. It was the small moments, the daily rhythms of life together. It was Priya laughing at one of his jokes while she worked at the anvil, sparks flying around her like fireflies. It was Greta and Paul playing in the yard, inventing elaborate games that made sense only to them. It was lying in bed at night with Priya's head on his shoulder, talking about everything and nothing until sleep claimed them both. It was the knowledge that he had found his place in the world, and that place was beside this woman, building this life, raising these children. That was the gift the raiders had tried to take from him at the river, and that was what he had fought to reclaim. Not just Priya's life, but the future they would build together, the family they would create, the love that would sustain them through all the years to come. On a warm evening in late summer, when Greta was 7 and Paul was 4, the whole family gathered on the porch to watch the sunset. Priya sat in the chair she had claimed as her own, Paul curled in her lap half asleep. Greta sat on the steps, sketching pictures of the landscape in a journal Ethan had given her. Ethan stood leaning against the railing, looking out at the land they had made home. "Tell us a story, Papa," Greta said without looking up from her drawing. "What kind of story?" Ethan asked. "A true one, about you and Mama." Ethan glanced at Priya, who smiled and nodded. "All right. Have I ever told you about the day we got married?" "Yes," Greta said. "Tell a different one." "How about the day we first met? We know that one too." Ethan thought for a moment. "What about the day I went to bring your mother home from the raiders?" Greta looked up at that, interested. "You never told us that one." "It is not a happy story," Priya said gently. "Not all of it." "But it has a happy ending," Ethan said. "Does it not?" Priya looked at him, at their children, at the home they had built together, and smiled. "Yes, it has a very happy ending." So Ethan told them the story, starting with the blood on his knuckles and Priya's scream from the river. He told them about the chase through the hills, about meeting Kessa, about the fort ruins and the negotiation and the ride home. He told them about the fear and the determination and the moment when he had held Priya in his arms and known that everything would be all right. He left out the worst parts, the violence and the threats, but he did not shy away from the truth of it. When he finished, both children were quiet, processing. Then Greta asked, "Were you scared, Papa?" "Yes," Ethan said honestly. "I was very scared. But I loved your mother more than I was afraid, and that made all the difference." Greta nodded, satisfied with that answer. Paul had fallen asleep in Priya's lap, his breathing soft and even. Priya stroked his hair absently, her eyes on Ethan. "That was a good story," she said quietly. "It was a good ending," Ethan corrected. "The story is still happening. Every day we are still writing it." "Then I like where it is going," Priya said, and her smile was bright in the fading light. They sat together as the sun slipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared, a family bound by love and choice and all the small moments that made up a life. The past was behind them, the future was ahead, and the present was right here, perfect and imperfect and wholly theirs. Ethan looked at his wife, his children, his home, and thought about the man he had been at the river crossing all those years ago. That man had been afraid and determined and willing to do whatever it took to protect what he loved. He was still that man, he realized, but he was also more. He was a husband and a father and a builder of futures. He was part of something larger than himself, something beautiful and complex and worth every sacrifice. "Thank you," he said quietly to Priya. "For what?" she asked, though her eyes said she already knew. "For choosing me. For building this life with me, for everything." Priya reached over and took his hand, squeezing gently. "Thank you for coming after me, for not giving up, for bringing me home." "Always," Ethan said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "I will always bring you home." They stayed on the porch until the stars were thick overhead, and the children were both asleep, Paul in Priya's arms and Greta leaning against Ethan's leg. Then they carried them inside to bed and tucked them in carefully, kissing foreheads and smoothing blankets. They stood in the doorway of the children's room for a moment, watching them sleep, then retired to their own room and their own bed. As Ethan lay in the dark with Priya beside him, her breathing evening out into sleep, he thought about the journey that had brought them here. The market where they met, the courtship that defied expectations, the proposal, the terrible day at the river, the desperate chase, the wedding, the house, the children. Each step had been a choice to move forward together, to build something that had not existed before. And now here they were, years later, with a life they had crafted from love and hard work and stubborn determination. It was not perfect. There were still people who disapproved of their marriage, still challenges and obstacles and days when everything seemed harder than it should be. But they faced those things together, and that made all the difference. Ethan closed his eyes and let sleep take him, secure in the knowledge that when he woke, Priya would be beside him. His children would be safe in their beds. His home would stand solid around them. The future they had fought for and built together would continue, one day at a time, one choice at a time, for as long as they both lived. It was a good life. It was the life he had chosen and the life that had chosen him in return. And as he drifted off to sleep, Ethan Prescott felt at peace, knowing that he was exactly where he was meant to be, with exactly the people he was meant to be with, for all the days yet to come.